start with introductions and a warm welcome to everyone back after the summer break. It's really great to see so many people joining today. We are very happy to resume our LEEPout seminar series today in environmental economics, hosted by the Land Environment Economics and Policy Institute, LEEP, at the University of Exeter Business School. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Michela Faccioli and I'm a research fellow at LEEP. So today, we're very privileged to have Vic Adamowicz, professor in environmental economics from the University of Alberta in Canada. Thank you very much, Vic, for accepting our invitation today. It's a great pleasure. As many of you will know, Vic has contributed with some significant advances in the field of environmental economics. His research focuses on integrating the environment into economic analysis to develop market and non-market based instruments for environmental conservation. And in particular, Vic's work is in the field of environmental valuation and consumer choice. As I'm sure you know, he has produced some pioneering work, especially in relation to stated and revealed preference modeling, which has been published in several top economic and science journals in many different environments. So today, Vic will present some of his latest research, focusing on the economic analysis of a complex wildlife disease, which is called chronic wasting disease. This disease is currently posing several challenges to the management of wildlife as well as recreationists, but little is known to date regarding what mechanisms might work best from an economic and policy perspective. So this presentation will rely on a range of economic methods to identify the costs and benefits of alternative approaches to address this important management problem. I hope I got it right, Vic.
That sounds pretty good, Dr. Michela.
So this is a very timely talk, given that given what we have unfortunately learned with wildlife-borne diseases like COVID-19 in recent months. So I'm sure that we will all learn something very interesting from this presentation, and I'm very confident that there will be loads of questions and discussion at the end as well. So before we start, I just wanted to go through some housekeeping very briefly. Today's presentation, including Q&As, should last for about 1 hour in total. We kindly invite every participant to please keep your microphone muted and your videos off just to avoid disruption and possibly problems with the networks for the whole duration of the talk. We will try to keep questions for the end, but we also encourage everyone to please submit their questions or comments through the chat box as they arise during the talk as well, especially if there are some clarifications questions, we will try to pick them as they come. And during the Q&A session, and to signal that you want to ask a question, you can also use the raise hand functionality if you wish, which is basically you can find it by clicking on the participants box, and it's at the bottom right corner. So you should all be aware that this seminar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available subsequently on our LEEPout webpage. And finally, if you're Twitter users and wish to tweet about this seminar or future LEEPout events, please use the hashtag LEEPout, which is a brand new creation of today. Without further ado, I would now like to warmly welcome Vic and leave him the floor for his presentation. So I will stop sharing my screen and leave the floor to Vic. Thanks, Vic.
Great, thanks, Michela, and thanks to Michela and Ben and Ian for inviting me. This is a good opportunity to try out some ideas and some new things that we're doing. Let me get my screen sharing going. Actually, let me stop that for a second. Let's share this screen. There. Hopefully you've got a presentation in front of you now. And I know the request was to put questions in the chat box and have discussion later, but if there's something obvious that is people are not following or understanding, then feel free to chime in. I think it's a relatively small crowd and a few names that I recognize, which is very nice to see people I haven't seen for a while. So this is talk about chronic wasting disease. I don't know how many people know about chronic wasting disease, so I'm going to spend a bit of time going over the background of that. Let me start by thanking a couple of people. You see a list of names there in the bottom of the slide with graduate students and colleagues that we've been working with. In particular, Lucy Xie, who's here today, has really been a driving force behind much of the analytical work here and a lot of the conceptual work, so I've benefited from that. Mike Kaczynski's here. We're going to talk about some of the newest things that we've been working on, so appreciate the help from all these folks. And just to continue with the thanks side of things, we've built a kind of social science team at the University of Alberta to be examining these issues around chronic wasting disease. That's part of an interdisciplinary team, and that was something that when I was chatting with Michaela about what topic to discuss, she was saying, well, something that is more interdisciplinary would be of interest to the group, and so that's why we chose this. And it's a fairly large group involving natural scientists and people in the government agencies and a host of funding agencies, ranging from genomics through to the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, to Cabela's, which I'll talk about, which is an outdoor sporting equipment store. So what am I going to do in a short period of time? I speak quickly, so I'll try to get through a bunch of material, and then maybe we can have a good conversation about this. I'm going to provide a bit of a description of chronic wasting disease and some of the implications, the impacts and management options. I'm going to start broadly from the North American or even global perspective, and then focus it down pretty quickly to Alberta, where I am. And I think there are a few nuances with the issue here that make it particularly challenging. And then we're going to talk about some management options and examining really the benefits and costs of alternative management options, and thinking about how to design these management options to engage individuals in trying to reduce, in our case, the spread and prevalence in wild populations. So we're going to focus on three different small studies within this. One is just a general question about the effect of chronic wasting disease on recreational hunting. That's one of the main impacts that there have been concerns about. Then we're going to look at two studies in a bit more detail. One is generating some incentives to target harvest to reduce the spread of chronic wasting disease. And I know this is a bit abstract right at this point if you don't know much of the background on chronic wasting disease. And then we're going to look at some economic experiments. So we're going to go from examining actual behavior in the recreation world and some contingent behavior or stated preference responses, and then look at the same kinds of issues but in a lab environment. And the unique context in this lab environment is that we're working with both students and non-students in a kind of framed field experiment. So we're really triangulating different methods to try to assess benefits and costs and mechanisms and what mechanisms might work. So we'll then wrap things up with a summary and discussion. And I did want to say, I know that there's some sensitivity around the issue of hunting, big game hunting, recreational hunting in different parts of the world. So I recognize that sensitivity. In our context, it's a part of what's regulated and certainly a very popular activity. But if you want to kind of step away from that, you can really interpret this in the context of those two listed contributions, that really thinking about spatial temporal substitution in recreation activities and as a response to an incentive. So that's quite a unique environment where we're trying to provide an incentive for people to engage in recreation to contribute to a broader public good, and then modeling that spatial and temporal substitution within that context. And then the contribution on the experimental side around the same sorts of issues is we're looking at incentives and nudges in an impure public goods context. And again, examining this with both student and non-student populations. Okay, so let's go on. What is chronic wasting disease? Well, chronic wasting disease is a prion disease. So it's, people have described it loosely as the version of VSC or mad cow disease, but within cervids, the deer population. So these are deer, moose, elk, reindeer, caribou. There's been a lot written on it. Okay, so chronic wasting disease is a prion disease. I'll talk a little bit about the sort of scale of impact. It's been around for a long time, back to the 60s, first wild occurrences in the United States in the 80s. But there's been a significant amount of spread in the last decade or so, I would say now. A couple of years ago, found in 3 European countries. Some questions about exactly how that occurred. And that bottom statement is one of the really challenging ones. There's no evidence of transmission to humans, but agencies have advised against eating meat that has not been tested. So, with all the COVID questions and such, issues around zoonotic diseases are raised. And so I think that's, again, piqued interest in chronic wasting disease. Now, there's two parts to this slide. There's the text part, and then there's the section with the graphic. Let me just highlight a couple things on the graphic. I find this one really fascinating from Escobar et al. So we have chronic wasting disease in these moose, elk, deer, cervid populations. This transmits through them. How does it transmit? Well, there are farmed cervids, and that's true in the UK as well as in North America. So there's transmission possibility through movement of farmed animals. There is, in North America, extensive hunting of cervid populations. So there can be transmission and spread through either carcasses or through hunter movement. Interestingly, chronic wasting disease stays in the soil or on plants and for a considerable amount of time, and that's still an area of investigation. So that's an interesting mechanism for spread. It's not just animal to animal or specified risk material. There's some concerns about chronic wasting disease through water or water sources as an attractant to cervid, certainly through fluids within cervids and through disposal. So as dispersal, as populations grow, animals move across the landscape and spread. Controversy about predators, whether predators act as spreaders or whether predators reduce populations and therefore control chronic wasting disease. And as we work our way up, there's concerns, of course, about transmission to humans, transmission to livestock, given the possibilities of prion diseases in livestock and pets. And so you can see the scale of different potential pathways of chronic wasting disease spread and impact. Now, if we look on the right-hand side of the slide, the impact on wild populations of cervids, who does that affect? Well, in our context in Canada, Indigenous people, I'll speak to this shortly, are large consumers of wild cervid populations and part of their cultural activities. Recreational hunters, but also just from a wildlife viewing or passive use value standpoint, there's concern about wildlife health and health of these cervid populations. There's a farmed cervid sector, so that's also an area of concern. Concerns from other livestock sectors, concerns about other wildlife species, so as I mentioned, predators, pets, others, and of course, public health concerns and international trade concerns. There's a whole range of different types of potential impacts and concerns associated with chronic wasting disease. I thought I'd bring in one. This is a fairly recent European food safety perspective, given now the evidence of chronic wasting disease in Europe. So here they focus really on testing and only allowing consumption after a test has proved that the meat is negative. And that is an important aspect, certainly in the farm cervid sector. But the focus on testing and consumption of venison or cervid products is really only one piece of the puzzle, and that's why I want to come back to wild populations and the impacts in North America. So there is a map of chronic wasting disease in North America. You can see where it's now spread to from some of its origins pre-2000. The little yellow dots are the captive facilities or the farmed operations. Those gray shaded areas are the wild populations. So the captive facilities, there are strict protocols and policies around impacts associated with the chronic wasting disease when it's found in depopulation and such, and a focus mostly on the wild populations. So let me do this. So that's Alberta, for those folks that don't know where Alberta is. You can see where the spread in the wild population is. This gives you a little bit of a sense of the trend over the past years of chronic wasting disease prevalence. You can see a dramatic increase in chronic wasting disease. You can see that it's somewhat species specific on the right-hand side. So the prevalence has gone up mostly in mule deer, and interestingly, mostly in male mule deer. So that's an issue around the biology that's really fascinating. This gives you a sense geographically of the spread. So on the left-hand side, 2010, relatively few. These are wildlife management units. You'll see these kinds of numbers in these areas in many of the slides. A relatively small spread relatively low prevalence. The darker colors are much higher prevalence. We look at 2019, and these are male mule deer. 2019, you can see that the many different wildlife management units with 30, 40, 50% of the deer infected. Now that starts to affect population numbers. And so you'll see population declines within those regions. And that's a very significant impact on those deer populations. And of course, you can also see the spread. So that's where the concern about wild populations, regardless of whether you're testing for human consumption of the meat products, this is affecting the wild populations and spreading across the landscape. Another interesting wrinkle, in the province of Alberta, there's another cervid species that are called woodland caribou. The gray areas identified on this map are the areas where woodland caribou exist. This is a highly endangered species. It's an iconic species in the country, and there's great concern about the impacts on woodland caribou from industrial activity as well as predators, and so significant interest in how to protect woodland caribou. If I bring up that same map of the wildlife management units on the right-hand side, that red line is basically the boundary between where chronic wasting disease has been found. It's south of that line. These two regions here were identified last year as regions of concern because there's evidence of chronic wasting disease. And you can see that that is just on the southern border of where this highly threatened endangered species is. So quite a lot of concern about spread to caribou. We know that it exists in reindeer, the same species in Europe. The chronic wasting disease was found in Norway, and so there's a distinct possibility that we'll enter the population areas of this particular endangered species. So that's a very different concern than you see in other jurisdictions. In Alberta and in Canada, we also have Indigenous people who rely heavily on traditional lands and foods, and cervids and wild cervids are a big part of that. Our colleague Brenda Partley has done a great deal of work on wild populations and Indigenous communities, concerns around risk communications and the importance of traditional knowledge. And communities are increasingly identifying chronic wasting disease as a concern, both from the food side, but also from the wildlife population side. There's some really fascinating work by Chu et al. Fairly recently, not so much on the food safety side, but just the fact that if wildlife populations decline because of chronic wasting disease, the substitution will be to much more expensive and likely less quality nutritionally purchases that are required to offset that loss in the diets of our Indigenous people. So significant concern from a purely economic standpoint around substitution. And just to give a sense of the scale of consumption of wild game, David Natcher and colleagues, about half of households harvesting traditional food makes up about 20% of their diet. So whether it's the health impacts, potential risks of chronic wasting disease, or the impacts because of population declines and substitution, you can see that's very significant. And of course, there's a high level of concern that was registered from this. And so about a year and a half ago, there was an organization of Indigenous chiefs within the province that have passed a resolution to focus on chronic wasting disease and surveillance. So this is a remarkable statement about the concern of this. And that really motivated, again, interest in thinking about reducing chronic wasting disease risks. So big picture, what are we thinking about for the economics? Well, we're really looking at the costs and benefits of management strategies. What makes sense to do? What would be the objective? What are the impacts of this on behavior and value? First, of chronic wasting disease itself. So what would we be doing if we reduce the risk? But also, what are the management strategies that we could try to implement? What are the costs and benefits of those strategies? So what are the options? Well, what should be the objectives? And I think where we've landed is really to think about reducing, particularly the spread. That may involve also reducing some prevalence. This disease is endemic with 50% of male mule deer infected or more in some regions. It's not going to be eradicated. It really, unfortunately, has to focus now on a policy of trying to reduce spread in very targeted regions. And so there are other options, but that's really where we're thinking that's one of the priority areas. You can also, of course, increase monitoring and surveillance just to make sure that it isn't spreading in other places where it's currently thought not to exist. And the option, of course, to do nothing, which, to be honest, for many years, many jurisdictions have done exactly that, done nothing and just continue to monitor and assess what the trend of impacts might be. So if we think about an objective of trying to reduce spread, in particular spread in these regions where it affects a threatened species, how would we do it? Well, there are a number of different approaches. Professional harvesters have been engaged in some jurisdictions, including in the case in Norway. In our context, recreational hunters are active on the landscape. There have been some suggestions to increase predator populations, and that has both pros and cons, which would make a fascinating doctoral thesis if somebody wants to tackle that. There's even some discussion about vaccines and gene drives. We're a long way away from that, but interestingly, there's some work in the UK that we've been following on developing gene drives to address some invasive mammal species that exist. Or again, you could just be very passive and provide information and hope that that's sufficient. We focused largely on the recreational hunting side. So what are the impacts on recreational hunters? Are they currently affected by chronic wasting disease? Could we think about programs, incentives for targeted harvesting? These may be monetary or non-monetary that would engage them in harvesting more and in reducing the spread of chronic wasting disease. And so this is an interesting conservation effort, in a sense, contributing to an impure public good, that the recreationists may benefit from these kinds of activities, but they'd also be contributing to the conservation effort. So why recreational hunters? Well, they're obviously active on the landscape. I find this interesting. This is by May and Goddard from a couple of years ago. This is the Canadian public and their preferences for different chronic wasting disease management strategies. And just in the circled area, targeted culling, targeted harvesting, the support has been growing dramatically over time. If you look at the 2009, 11 to 18, and is very positive. Additional hunting tags or hunting opportunities to hunters, again, positive, growing over time. Of course, the passive approaches, public meetings and education, are also very highly supported. You see the one that's negative in the middle there, which is do nothing. So there's a opposition to doing nothing and a lot of support for engaging in targeted culling. And again, this is national. Another national survey by DeRoche and Lukert, just to highlight a couple things. Sharpshooters, so professional harvesters, very organized harvesters, those are all negative in the overall utility measure, that there is not support for those types of activities. So let's talk a little bit about recreational hunting. That may not be familiar to people in the UK, and at least the context in Alberta and North America. It's highly regulated. Wildlife is owned by the Crown. I put that word in specifically. So these are publicly owned. Individuals cannot own wildlife until after it's been captured and harvested. There's hunting on both public and private land. You can't charge for access. Hunters can't sell harvest, so there are markets in this sense. It's administratively organized around licenses that are actually quite inexpensive, $40 or so for a license for a season. Interestingly, hunting license sales and activity has been increasing or stable in the province, and there are a number of reasons for that. One of them that's starting to emerge is discussion that this is a source of organic and healthy protein. People are moving away from other types of protein and are starting to substitute hunted game meat. And hunters are informed about chronic wasting disease in a variety of ways. And we've been surveying hunters for a long time, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that. We've been chatting with them since 2007 on issues around chronic wasting disease. A couple of quick summary statistics. Well, hunters are concerned about chronic wasting disease and the impact on wildlife. Not everybody. There's diversity of opinions. Some are concerned about human health impacts, but again, not everybody. These 2 points, the majority of hunters get the meat tested before they consume and give it away, but some don't. So there's heterogeneity in risk preferences. And these findings have been pretty stable over the years, perhaps because the levels have been relatively low in terms of prevalence, but generally they've been stable. So I'm now going to morph into these 3 separate studies. So the first question is, if we're going to engage recreational hunters in harvesting and in aiding in this conservation effort, step 1 would be, are they actually being driven away by chronic wasting disease currently? And that's been a hypothesis that's been circulating for quite a while. So we attack this question through reveal preference data on what are called draw licenses or demand for draw licenses. And that's our colleague, John Pattison. He's standing by one of the locations where you drop off chronic wasting disease material for testing. This is joint with some colleagues from the government of Alberta and Lucy, as I already mentioned. So what we analyze is data over a 13-year period of individuals who basically put their name in where they'd like to hunt in a particular region for a particular species. So they put their name in for a lottery, essentially, to receive one of those permits for these specific species. This gives us an indication of the demand. So we examine that over time and over space. Over that time period, chronic wasting disease has spread, has grown dramatically. So we have variation over time and space in prevalence, and we've examined various kinds of approaches for specifying prevalence. This panel data, so we use fixed effects models, and we include a host of other control variables. We can chat about this in detail, but I think this image really shows the picture over those 3 time periods. There's not a lot of change in the demand for these applications or licenses. It's been shifting around a little bit in space. It moves around. But this is the region that we've seen dramatic increases in spread in chronic wasting disease, basically moving from the east to the west and growing dramatically. When we do the analysis, there's a little snippet of a table in there. We find no evidence that hunters are adversely affected by chronic wasting disease. Now, you can take that message in many of various ways. They may be getting the meat tested, and so they're not concerned about presence of chronic wasting disease. They may not be concerned about it. But it appears even in areas where chronic wasting disease is growing rapidly, demand for these applications may be growing. So what are the implications for management? Well, that actually keeps the door open for increased opportunities for hunting and engaging hunters in management. Similar things have been found recently in the US. And as I say, this is different than people were speculating with the origins of chronic wasting disease. So that's step 1. Now, step 2, what kind of incentives might work to motivate these targeted harvests? Remember, we're trying to target harvests in particular regions of the province to prevent spread. And so for this, we've employed a joint model with actual behavior and contingent behavior. So the actual behavior gives us some information on where hunters are going, how often they're going, what are their preferences around the different attributes of sites. And then we're going to use contingent behavior to offer different kinds of incentives and try to assess the impacts of these different incentive programs. And in particular, we're going to examine extending the seasons for hunting and providing additional opportunities for hunting. So again, this is work by Lucy and colleague Pat White-Smith at Saskatchewan who've been working on this. Again, think about it as making the season slightly longer, providing incentives to hunt more often and to harvest additional animals, and whether that would, as a non-monetary type of incentive, generate a demand response, and what would the value of that response be?
Vic, sorry to interrupt. I think I've just spotted a question in the audience, a clarification question
right.
regarding the data that you were using. I don't know if you want to briefly...
Yeah, thanks, Brett. No, those we tried to get individual data, but we weren't allowed to have individual data, so those are by region. So each one of those little regions varies across there. Thanks, that was a good question.
Okay, thanks, Vic.
Thanks, Vic.
So back to this issue of the revealed and stated preference data. So how do hunters make these spatial and temporal decisions, and how do those, or can they be influenced by this kind of incentive? I should say we also examined other incentives, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. How do we do this? We're using a Kuhn-Tucker model, so not a repeated random utility model, which is common in this literature. This is really a model of how many trips individuals take, how many more trips, or would they take more trips with an extended season and additional incentives, and would they take those trips in the regions that are targeted for chronic wasting disease management. This is an online sample of hunters, mule deer hunters in the province. It was administered by the government agency. We've had tremendous partnership with the government agencies, reasonable response rate. We've actually been collecting these data now for a couple more years, so we're augmenting this analysis. And then we're really asking the question of what would the response to this incentive program be. So there's a Kuhn-Tucker model. The travel cost is monetary and time cost. We're going to estimate the utility parameters as a very structural, highly structured model. We're going to be looking at those parameters to see how they respond to the extended season and whether we generate additional welfare associated with those additional seasons or increased season lengths. So a bit of a descriptive. So what are people doing in the hunting season? That's about 30 days. RP is revealed preference. They're taking on average about 10 trips. Now, in the stated preference case, we offered in this particular incentive program, we offered them an extended season. The extended season would move them, let's say, into December rather than November when the regular season is. And you can see right in the descriptive data that there's a substitution that occurs. They hunt more. So if you add up the extended and regular season, you get 15.7 or 15.8 trips. That's more than in the regular season. And they substitute from the regular season to the extended season in a modest way. Now that's exactly what we're modeling, is both the spatial and temporal substitution that occurs. A quick snapshot of one of the sets of results. So again, these are baseline marginal utility parameters, so they take a little bit of interpretation to sort out. Let's look at a couple. Chronic wasting disease, this again sort of triangulates with the previous analysis. Chronic wasting disease is not significantly affecting the location or the number of hunting trips that are taken. So that fits with the previous analysis. Extended season has a negative parameter, so it's not as preferred as the regular season. So it's less desirable than the regular season, but that's what that parameter tells us. The December component is preferred to the October component. So given an extended season, hunters would prefer to hunt in December as an extended season. And lastly, contingent behavior relative to the revealed preference. We're not seeing any impact in the utility parameters of contingent behavior, suggesting a kind of validity or a convergent validity within those two types of data collection. So what do we see when we do the welfare analysis? Well, the incentive program offers increased welfare to hunters. So contributing to the public good, they get a private benefit, plus ideally they'd also be contributing to the harvest of the deer that would then reduce eventually chronic wasting disease. What's a bit of a challenge is that as you move from, in this case, the 100 to 200 to 500 series, we probably want to focus these harvests on the 500 series. That's up in the north part of this spatial diagram. That's where the spread needs to be reduced. And that's where the lowest willingness to pay or welfare impact is for an extended season. So that is both a plus and a minus associated with this, that hunters are interested and would benefit from these extended seasons and contributing to the conservation cause. But spatially, it may be more challenging. Again, interestingly, they really get benefit from these high prevalence regions that are in the middle of the chronic wasting disease region. So summarize, yes.
Just quickly, I was just interested to understand how much that was driven by the population distribution of people. Basically, these more remote regions, more remote from people, is what you're saying. So the less likely trips.
That's true. So because of the travel costs, because the travel costs will be greater to them. Now, interestingly, those 500 series is just a little bit north of Edmonton, where I live, which is one of the major population centers in the province. So it's actually not that much further for hunters in Edmonton. So it's a bit of a mixture because the hunters are distributed all over the province. But you're right, if one generally was looking at it, it would be in part travel cost. So I guess immediately that pops into my mind, maybe there's a mixture of a monetary incentive to offset that travel cost impact and the extended season. And we haven't looked at mixed incentive systems like that. Good point. Okay, so general conclusions, as I said, triangulates with the chronic wasting disease result previously that hunters are not being adversely affected, at least in aggregate. We are seeing spatial and temporal substitution behavior it's kind of unique in recreation demand models to look at both of those aspects. And we're getting increased hunter satisfaction in these CWD infected areas, and we get welfare gain, but as mentioned, it's heterogeneous across sites. Okay, let's go on to the newest part. We haven't actually presented any of these, but we thought that gives us some idea of behavior from surveys of hunters. What if we took this into the lab and started to think about the same kind of questions, but in a lab context? And again, the motivation is to think about this contribution to a public good In our case, this is a public good where people are contributing quantity of hunting trips, quantity of harvests that will contribute to the chronic wasting disease problem. So we're examining that as a public good game, an impure public good game. And this is also a framed field experiment. So we actually, and it's not exactly like a video game, but we set it up like a recreational hunting game. And we're looking at both students and non-students. So we brought recreational hunters into the lab, which is, I think, a first and was a fascinating experience. So the question is, how do we use these? In our case, we're going to examine now both monetary and non-monetary incentives, as well as framing in this impure public goods game. So this is Lucy again, and me and Mike Kaczynski at Delaware. There's a shot of us, Lucy and our research colleagues, in one of the sporting goods stores where we were recruiting hunter subjects, which I can tell a lot of stories about that whole process. What's the theoretical framework? Well, we're really basing it originally on the kind of Levitt and List model, because we're interested in that pi is the sort of standard utility function where there are returns to individuals, and M is more this sort of moral ethical component or non-monetary component, where we're going to be looking for potential for motivational crowding in or crowding out components with that element. In the monetary returns, the way we've stylized it, the individuals get a private benefit. That's kind of what you'd see in a regular travel cost model. And then they also have a public benefit because they're going to be contributing to this wildlife conservation effort. And that depends on how they and the other hunters within their group behave and how they reach different contribution thresholds. So the public goods are actually linked into a biological model where we're understanding how additional harvests, as they grow, will contribute to the reduction in chronic wasting disease. And of course, they face costs because they have to take trips, and those trips are going to be costly. We're going to examine this motivational crowding piece to see if there's some interactions between the incentives that we provide and the non-monetary returns piece. So what do? We've got treatment groups. We start with control rounds. This recreational hunting stylized occurs, treatments occur, and then we go back to control rounds. We've got about 100 students and only 30 hunters. So that's an issue we'll have to try to deal with. But we think it's a large enough sample for us to make some interesting statements. There are 4 treatments. Extra hunting tags, so that generates trips, contributes to the conservation effort. We add a pro-social treatment to the social information statement to the extra hunting tags, using things that have been used in the past in wildlife management to see if that has an impact. We offer them then fixed monetary rewards. So this is actually what was being discussed earlier in this context: hunting tags, non-monetary, and then monetary rewards for harvest. I should say that's generally been frowned upon in the wildlife and conservation community, but we'll see how that works in an economic context. And then in the treatment 4, instead of a fixed monetary reward, we make those a lottery with the same expected value in the outcome. So again, back to it. Yes.
I might have been the only one who missed this, but what was a hunting tag? Is this your?
Oh, yes. So this to harvest an animal, you need a tag.
Okay.
So basically, this is an allowance to harvest an additional animal, and that generates private benefits because there are the benefits from harvesting to the individual. They have to take more trips. The way the theoretical model works, they have to take more trips to harvest more animals, but they have the ability to do that. And then by harvesting, they also contribute to the public good because they're reducing the population.
Thank you.
Good question. Yeah, I actually had in my notes to explain tags. Thanks. All right. What's the payoff function? Well, as mentioned, it's already a combination of this private component, the public component. So they get a private component from their own activity as well as from any monetary incentives that they're provided. There's a public component based on the wildlife models and how they would contribute to this conservation effort. And then there's the costs. So we know what those outcomes are from these different public goods games. We know what the Nash equilibria are. So for example, here are the payoff functions for the different treatments. And you can see that for each treatment, we expect a different Nash equilibrium point because there are different incentives associated with them. So we'll be able to evaluate whether our experiment subjects move to the Nash equilibrium or move to a social optimum. And then as you can see at the bottom, there are additional payoffs for achieving different conservation goals, and that's based on this public benefit side from the epidemiological models. So it's been a lot of fun actually to integrate these different pieces. Let's look at some results. So let's look at the left-hand side first, the students. So the green bars in the middle, that's the response to the treatment. Those gray bars on the either side of each one of these graphs is the control pre-treatment and then post-treatment back to the control again. And you've got two different lines. If you look first at that student extra tag, I hope you can see a line at 5. Those are the Nash equilibria, and then a slightly lighter gray dashed line at 6. That's the social optimum. So we look at students. Extra tags have an impact. There are additional trips taken. They're hovering around the Nash equilibrium. We move to the next to the right T2, so we take that same treatment and add prosocial information. We do looks just eyeballing it. There's a bit of a bump, so prosocial information has some impact. We go down to the T3, which is tags plus fixed rewards, and we get an impact. There's an increase in the number of trips taken and implicitly number of harvests. A little bit below the Nash equilibrium in this context. And then if we put in lottery rewards, we get a little bit more. Now let's contrast that with the hunters. Again, these are frame field experiments. The hunters are bringing in whatever context they have. You can see the extra tags has an impact above the Nash in the early rounds at the social optimum, fascinatingly. The tags plus prosocial information beyond the Nash equilibrium and in some cases beyond the social optimum, which is fascinating. Fixed rewards, some impact again, we're hovering around the Nash, and the lottery rewards a little bit lower than the Nash equilibrium. So we examine those econometrically, I'll show in a second and just give you the outcome. The other thing we look at is there an effect of when you remove these programs? So what happens when you go back to the control rounds? Is there a crowding in or a crowding out? So for example, once you take a fixed reward off, do people hunt less than they did in the previous control round? Or do they hunt more, which suggests that they maintained this incentive program somehow in their mind, even though the incentive is turned off? What do we find? Prosocial information works. Crowding in effect for students and hunters, so we get more trips than you would expect under the theoretical model. Extra tags plus prosocial information contributes more. The crowding out effects of monetary rewards. So we actually find two different effects depending on if it's students or hunters. The fixed monetary rewards have a crowding out effect. So the individuals are actually lower than the expected outcome for students. And lotteries, interestingly, have a crowding out effect for hunters. The removal of incentives, if we take these incentive programs off, the prosocial information crowds out students. So after you take it off, they actually are less engaged in the activity than they were in the previous control round. The removal of the fixed monetary reward has crowding in for hunters, so they maintain a higher level of effort. This sort of raises an interesting point in 2 points. One is our experiment subjects of students are different from our non-student experiment subjects, which is something that hasn't been examined a lot in the literature. And sometimes when it has, it's been found to not have an impact. We're seeing a difference. If we rely on the hunters, relatively small sample, but if we rely on them for the policy information, then we get a different outcome than if we relied on students. So what are the conclusions from this? Prosocial information works. And if we're advising, and we will advise managers, we recommend them use the prosocial information. Monetary rewards depends. If we were using the hunter sample, we'd be using those fixed rewards for chronic wasting disease management. And the time horizon matters. Prosocial information, if we can hold it for a long period, and monetary incentives, that might have some spillover effects when these policies have to be removed. So this gives us a little bit of a flavor from a very different but very controlled approach to examining the same issue. All right, let me wrap up. So overall, when chronic wasting disease impacts were first being examined within North America, it was a doom and gloom scenario. Individuals, researchers, and we were involved in some of these studies too, thought that it was going to have a significant adverse negative impact on hunting activities and recreation. And basically, it doesn't appear that it has. There could be a number of reasons. Some people have stopped, but new studies are showing that there's really relatively little impact at this point. That might change with concerns about zoonotic diseases and about the spread and such. In terms of engaging hunters in management, this still has to be tested on the biological side. We can certainly increase harvests, and we see from these various programs we can generate incentives that will engage hunters to participate in these programs. We're suggesting non-monetary incentives like extended seasons and pro-social framing. That seems to be one that comes strongly through the research. But we've got to move to a field trial, a randomized control trial, if you like, actually on the ground, and there are discussions about that. So let me wrap up from the biggest scale. This is a really challenging disease. We've looked at it just in terms of a narrow focus of reducing spread, engaging recreational hunters, but there are a whole host of concerns and really relatively little action that's been taking place. We've been focusing on engaging hunters and other programs, enhanced surveillance and such. There's a whole host of things we could talk about around farm surveys and testing protocols and investments in technologies and such. Where are we going in the future? Ideally, we'd love to try these programs, and I think there's some conversation about having that on the ground, actually providing these incentive programs. We're starting to work with Indigenous people and their concerns and their interests and how they may also contribute to these harvesting and monitoring efforts, and generally improving our data collection around behavior and responses to these incentives and perceptions and knowledge. So I went a little bit longer than I'd hoped, but that hopefully gives you a whirlwind tour through chronic wasting disease from the very big picture all the way down to recreational hunters. And there's that photo of us again in one of those recreational goods and services stores, collecting respondents for experiments in a fascinating set of experiment outcomes. All right,
That was fascinating. Thank you very much, Vic.
Stop that. Great.
It was great. I think we have now about 10 minutes or maybe slightly more for questions if someone wants to ask has any comment or any question.
Questions or recommendations. I said these are early days, and I'm curious about responses and thoughts.
I'll kick us off.
Hey, Brett, go ahead.
Do you want to increase the volume a bit? I think it's a bit.
Oh, it's probably because I was leaning back a bit.
Great, yeah.
That's it, about here to be heard. Yeah, that was great, Vic. And there was so much things I wanted to know detail on, so I'll just have to get in and dig in and read the papers as well. But I was just wondering, it seems to me that one of the things here is the sort of spatial targeting of where this culling or hunting of species go on. Is there any way you can compare? It seems to me that a focused sort of cull by trained hunters, a little bit like they tried, not very successfully with badgers in this country, might be more effective at dealing with that. And a comparison of your method to something which is very effective or much more spatially targeted would be interesting to see how far off you're getting, and then see how close you could get through manipulating incentive mechanisms. I hope that makes sense as a question.
Yeah, no. I mean, in a perfect world, that would be a great thing to test, and maybe something we could test to examine engaging recreational hunters versus professional harvesters or so-called sharpshooters and such. Several jurisdictions have engaged professional hunters, including Norway. I mean, that's basically how they reduced something like 6% of their reindeer population in that particular region. So here are the interesting questions around it. So practically, there's public opposition to that approach, and so there would have to be a efficacy, a communication program, et cetera. Whereas there's support for recreational hunters because they're already in the field, they have that kind of local knowledge, and I think we may even get more interest with Indigenous people, and they're contributing to those harvests for a variety of reasons. And I think some of this goes back to some of the earliest days of programs within this part of the world. And there was just a great outcry that this was not an appropriate way to deal with this. Now that may change if the risk levels change or if the spread really ramps up. there may be a different perception of those types of programs. In principle, yeah, we should be testing those against the efficacy of using recreational hunters. We know, and there has been some evidence that they harvest differently, they have different knowledge levels and such. Publicly, it would be an interesting thing to try to engage in, and I think a bit of a challenge to start down that line.
Right.
I hope. Yeah, I mean, that's why this is such a fascinating question, because there are so many different bits and pieces to it. That I did notice a question of why not just allow hunting all year long. Well, this is really tied into the biology and why hunting is highly regulated. That hunting is only allowed at certain periods to maintain populations. It's viewed as really as a conservation tool, and you don't want to interfere with rearing of animals or interfere with the breeding times. And so there's really targeted within particular periods. And that's why we're only moving a little bit with an extended season into November or back into October. And even there, the biologists were somewhat concerned about some of the impacts around the biology of the species and the impacts that it would have there. So, yeah, now I'm seeing some activity in the chat box.
Yeah, I think
there we go. Mike's already explained it. Okay, thanks. Mike, yeah, well done.
Can I ask a question?
You did it in one sentence. Go ahead, Ian. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm afraid there's two questions. The first is the understanding, or the degree of understanding, and maybe how it changes between hunters and the public about the effectiveness of culling with regard to CWD, because of course you don't know that a deer has got CWD before you pull the trigger.
Correct.
It hasn't got a big sign on its side. And that means you could be killing a perfectly healthy deer.
Correct.
And given the level of belief that people south of your country have in science, I just wonder what the what the state of play is with regards to that. And the second question was just really quick. I just thought it was interesting that one of the most clear differences across your treatments and samples was that hunters don't like gambling, which I found a bit odd.
Yeah. So let me try to address the first one. I think there is a difference in knowledge levels, and we've seen that in the public surveys versus the hunter surveys. Within the hunter population, there's, of course, heterogeneity in knowledge and understanding. What they do, though, is they recognize the role of harvesting within the kind of broader conservation sense, and so that sort of fits. Mm. It doesn't actually matter if I shouldn't say that. If you harvest a CWD infected deer, of course that will reduce the spread and prevalence, but reducing deer population in general will as well, because of course this is one of the biggest transmission vectors is numbers of populations and when the deer aggregate. So actually people who really want to see deer and put out food for deer are actually contributing to the spread of chronic wasting disease because the deer aggregate. They aggregate at water sources. So thinning the populations slows down the spread. We're going to get into some interesting discussions about various sort of zoonotic spread models, and that's what our ecology colleagues have been studying. Is it's not just population, it's landscape, it's movement patterns, it's how they come together at various times of year because of the biology of the species. So those are really interesting pieces that, again, think about integrating the ecology into a bioeconomic model would be a fascinating progress. There's one study out of Wyoming that's tried to do a bit of that within the Yellowstone complex and chronic wasting disease. But you do have these multiple levers, and one is just to reduce population size.
Yeah.
On the experiment, I don't know. I mean, we only started looking at the results of these, I don't know, maybe about a month ago, and we've got a number of different speculations as to why that might be occurring. Mike or Lucy, you can chime in at some point if you wish. It could just be that they prefer this to be a very direct. Don't make it a game with a lottery. Let's just focus on what the objective is. That's one of the things we speculated. Focus on the objective. Provide us with these extra opportunities. There's an extra reward associated with harvest, and let's just do that rather than some sort of a prize-winning game. But that's sort of pure speculation in a way. There's anecdotal evidence. I should say it is fascinating to sit in a lab with a group of hunters and do an experiment.
Yeah, just one follow-up on that last thing. So Brett has done a lot of work on ordering effects in stated preference. And I'm a bit of a skeptic about it. But did you do your gambling after your fixed payment? Because I can see why that would have a negative effect on a hunter. If you said, okay, here's a fixed payment, and they're going to go, yeah, that's great, that's fantastic. And then the next one is, okay, now it's a risky payment. Was there an ordering there?
So in the experiment, these are independent treatments. So there's one treatment that's a fixed payment. That's a group. There's another treatment that's a lottery prize, right? So with those 4 different treatments, extra tags plus pro-social, fixed payment, lottery reward.
Okay. I think we have one question from Ben as well, and then I wanted to ask something as well if we have time.
Sure. I like Ben's the other Ben on social distancing. Yes, this is social distancing. Very well done, Ben.
Sorry, yeah, no, my question was just kind of, and I'll try and be quick, Michaela, was on kind of population densities actually of these deer. So we, compared to kind of historical kind of population densities, where you obviously had natural predators on the landscape, are we thinking about these deer as being much more kind of aggregated in some areas and then kind of obviously missing from the kind of very, very kind of changed landscape areas? Is that
it's a good point. So of course, they like agricultural settings, especially when there's grain around. So there have been some significant increases. They're in regions where they're not hunted as intensely. Now, again, in some of these regions, especially as you're moving to the north, there's less of that kind of intensive agricultural activity, and so you won't see that big of a change. Climate change has actually increased some of these deer populations because of the changing landscape. That actually is bad news for the caribou, but good news for the deer. But as we see these prevalence rates of 30, 40, 50%, 30% is the sort of threshold number where those populations start to decline. And so I think we're likely, if we're not already seeing it, we will be seeing population declines in those regions back to probably levels before any of those kinds of settlements or increases in agricultural outcomes. So a bit of a mixed bag, I would say, on what's been happening on the population side. It's not like there's been an explosion of population and now this is going to bring it back a little. I think it's much more nuanced than that.
Great. I had a quick question about like the next steps and moving forward, really, because I think you covered really well the implications for recreationists from very different angles. I was wondering, like going forward, were you planning to also consider, for example, the perspective of the other potentially affected actors like farmers through their livestock, or like the general public through like their general perception of the, not necessarily recreational values, but also just the perception of the management of the habitats and the wildlife? And so were you planning to sort of go into these different directions, or are you aware of any work that has been looking at this already?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, my colleague Ellen Goddard has been doing much of that work over the last few years. That's that chart I showed you with the public preferences. She's been continuing that kind of work, and I think that will continue. There's also the issue around farm cervids and, meat in restaurants, venison and such. And so those are all the issues around chronic wasting disease there, which is, again, a whole set of fascinating topics and discussions. I mean, I think if I was picking, I mean, I think some of the opportunity to actually do these sort of randomized controlled trials would be fascinating. I think building these bioeconomic models to really try to integrate the ecology and the targeting and the biology of these species with the incentive-based programs we're thinking about, I think will be a fascinating opportunity for chronic wasting disease, but also generally just to think about how to structure these models in a unique kind of context. And then I'm just looking at a question in the chat box. Interaction between hunter choices. Yeah, it's a really good question. So how do the hunters themselves? So of course they do often hunt. Families hunt together or groups hunt together. So we're thinking more broadly that those groups would then cooperate with other groups. And the word is really heterogeneity. I think there are groups within the hunter populations that we talk to that are very engaged and very supportive of these kinds of conservation efforts. But there are other groups that prefer not to interact. They may not even perceive this as an issue, and they may be. Well, there's another group within this that will be adversely affected by increased harvests, and that's the group of outfitters, and they are opposed to any of these types of efforts because they feel this is a threat to their livelihood. These are people who are guides for individuals who come from outside the province. They are required to have a guide, and so they feel this is a threat to their industry. So again, that makes this a challenging situation because you've got a group who feels this is an impact on their livelihood, and so they won't agree with these kinds of policies.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. This is me. I was just thinking through interactions through the elements on the objective function, because if there is high density, obviously you reduce the culling cost. Yeah, right. But you increase the control of the disease, the public good.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
But if there is, and therefore what your incentive does is that even with low density, you compensate for the increase in the culling cost due to that low density. Yeah. Therefore, right. I think through those elements, there can be some interacting,
yes.
Complex on the interactions because animals. I mean, I work on providing incentive to the horticulture industry for trees.
Okay.
Plant outbreaks in trees.
Yeah.
But animals, of course, move.
Right.
Yeah, and that is a key difference. So in an area, they are hunting quite highly. Yeah. You have some externalities to the hunter's next door. Yeah, because you're lowering the density, will you increase the culling cost, which means that the government might have to pay even higher incentives to convince farmers to harvest, because otherwise they won't have, they won't have.
Yeah, that's
so
a great
all these things I was thinking whether you have thought about.
Well, we have not sorted them out, that's for sure. That's a really great point. And again, I think what you're describing is, in a sense, a kind of dynamic model that we've got the biology of the population, and depending where that is, and depending what kind of a culling effort you have, that'll have an impact on the future.
Yeah.
And may affect hunters. It will affect biology. Absolutely. That's why I think working on these sort of bioeconomic models will be a really cool next step. But you're right that there's this kind of externality that's imposed between parties depending on the conditions and the amount of harvest that they do. Sort of like the fisheries models with externalities affecting each other. Yeah, it's a really good point.
I was just wondering whether in the experiment you communicate to the other hunters what did the others choose? We have
not, other than, in the experiments we communicate what the aggregate is, because the aggregate the outcomes where they reach their thresholds. But we haven't got an interaction where that would affect costs, for example.
Right.
That the costs are at the individual level and that's their own cost. But that's a very interesting point. I mean, you could have it feeding back and affecting the cost. Yeah, fascinating. Search costs, for example, would be one thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cool.
Great. So I think I just wanted to thank, first of all, Vic for the great presentation. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it greatly, and everyone else who managed to attend the presentation today. Before we all leave, I just wanted to make a small announcement, because basically, we have some new dates. I can't really screen share now. We have some dates, some confirmed speakers for the future LEEPout seminar series, which is apparently continuing until February. So that's good news, and we hope to really see you there. These are just some names of future speakers and some dates. We will, of course, post everything in our website, and we will also email these details to the people that are registered for our newsletter. So if you haven't done so and you're still interested, please sign up. And we really hope to see as many of you as possible next time. And thanks everyone again for attending, and especially thanks, Vic.